So you're interested in becoming an Airbnb host. Maybe you've been staying in multiple Airbnbs or VRBOs and you've thought, oh, this is super cool. I'd like to provide this kind of service to other people. Or maybe you've been trolling the internet and finding all sorts of videos and podcasts about how easy it is to become an Airbnb host, and you can make all sorts of money. And this is a super easy way to get involved in real estate ownership. Maybe not. Maybe some of the information out there is a little bit aggressively hyped. Maybe there's some things you really need to think about. So welcome. Let's go ahead and start looking at some of the things that are really important if you want to engage with short-term rentals. First of all, I am Justin Miller. I'm the co-founder and principal at the Chong Miller Group. At the Chong Miller Group, we help people buy and sell homes. We help people build wealth through real estate. So now the first thing I want to mention is I am not a tax accountant. I am not an attorney. The information I'm going to provide you in this video is knowledgeable. It is correct, but it's generic. And so if you're going to engage in these activities, I strongly suggest that you go find a tax accountant who deals with short-term rentals so that you make sure you're engaging in the activities exactly correctly per your needs, your position. If you need references to accountants who specialize in this area or attorneys who deal in this area, let me know. I can share that information with you and would be happy to do so. But I used to be a business school professor for 10 years, teaching undergraduates and MBA students at the University of Southern California, the Ohio State University. While I do real estate now, I've got a lot of experiential knowledge that's gained through my prior careers, as well as doing the activities now in the real estate market and being an investor. So with that note, let's go ahead and start thinking about why short-term rentals. And I'll start with why I'm thinking about short-term rentals. My partner, Jason, came to me and said, this short-term rental thing is really neat. Maybe we should do this. Maybe it'd be really interesting. And I'm actually a little bit skeptical by nature. And so I suggested to him he needs to do a lot of research. And in the doing of that lot of research, we would figure out whether or not this actually made sense to engage in. And so he started that research process. And this is kind of the culmination of what we've learned through that process. I'm going to share it with you here so that you don't have to go through multiple months. You actually can capture here in this video the really important points that we learned as we're going through this research. Airbnb VRBO, which is owned by Expedia, because Expedia wanted to make sure they were not losing out on this part of the travel industry. And there are other platforms as well. They all are part of the short-term rental or STR space in the economy. And so I'll refer to STRs, which is generic as opposed to Airbnbs or VRBOs or vacation rentals or other things like that. So as we think about short-term rentals, STRs, the first thing you need to ask yourself is, do you want to do this as a business? Or is this just something you have in your mind that occasionally you might rent out a property for short term, either your primary residence or a new vacation home that you buy? If you're thinking this is something, hey, it might be interesting just to allow some people occasionally to pay you a little bit of money to stay in your place, that's fine, totally fine. But that means it's not a business. And so some of the issues that we talk about through this video will be really important still, but some of the issues will take on less urgency. Now, for those of you who are thinking about this as a business, which is how I have to think about this, it's a way to raise money to generate revenue. It's an investment. that one would acquire in order to seek a return. If you're thinking about this as a business, then all of the information that we're going to talk about in this video is directly relevant to you. Okay, so if this is a business, then the first thing we need to do is we need to figure out what's this business going to look like. Now, some people will do business plans. I don't think you need to do a business plan, but what you do need to do is you need to create a business model. Now, let me explain. A business model is simply a quick mathematical formula that says revenues and costs are whatever they happen to be. Ideally, at the end of your business modeling process, your revenues will exceed your costs, but we'll find that out over a little bit of time. Now, when we're creating our business model, I'm not talking about writing down your goals. I'm not talking about writing out biographies. I'm not talking about sources of funds. I'm not talking about a 60-page document. I'm literally talking about something that can go on one page. But you need to think about these issues, because if you do not think about the business model, you'll have no idea how much money you could bring in or where that money could be generated from, nor will you know the costs of bringing in those funds. So let's talk about this explicitly. The business model, we want to know what our revenue streams may be. Where does revenue come from? Now, in a short-term rental market, the revenue is generally going to come from your daily rental rate on your home. Every night that home is rented out, you're going to collect rental income, revenue. Okay. Now, maybe there's some other rental streams that you could imagine, but your primary one is that. If you can think of additional rental revenue streams, fine, include those in your model. So right now, we're not putting in any numbers. We're just putting in labels. So we've got revenue, and revenue stream number one is daily rental rate. Weekend days may be more expensive to rent from us, our short-term rental, than non-weekend days. Or maybe there's a seasonal issue where some seasons you're going to get more money than during other seasons. So we could put in an average rate, right? And maybe we actually want to list our revenue as two streams. First stream is off-season rates, and second stream is on-season, high season rates, if we're in an area that's going to be very seasonal. Okay, so we're just putting those labels there on our page, revenue and one or two or however many different streams of revenue. There's no reason to overcomplicate this. You don't need Monday streams and Tuesday streams and etc. We want to keep it simple, but we want to have sufficient information on this page to uncover what's actually going on in our business. So in addition to your revenues, you have costs. And what are the costs? The costs are those things that you must pay on an ongoing basis in order to have the asset and engage in the activity that generates your revenue from the business. So you need to acquire a house. Unless this is your house that you already own, and maybe you're moving out of it, you're going to convert your existing house into a short-term rental, you're going to need to go out and acquire a house. Now, there's two ways to acquire a property that you may put into the short-term rental pool. The first is you buy the house. The second is you lease the house. You engage in what's referred to as rental arbitrage. Now, I want to caution you really carefully about rental arbitrage. If you take out a long-term lease, let's say you go find a property and you take out a 1 or 2 year lease on that property in order to then engage in your own short-term leases, you would be subletting the property. That would be the term. You're creating subleases, and they would be of a short-term nature. So short-term or any kind of sublease needs permission of the owner of the property. So what you need to do if you want to engage in rental arbitrage is you need to make sure you talk to the landlord, the owner of the property, that they've given you permission to engage in subleasing. You'll know you have the permission because it'll be written into your lease contract. Subleases are permissible, and the owner will have told you, yes, totally fine, I'm good with that. Some owners will permit this. Many owners will not. You need to make sure you check and get written permission. If you do not have permission, you lease a property, no permission to do it, you start subleasing. You'll lose the property, you'll lose your business, and you may be subjecting yourself to significant financial penalties in the way of fines and in the way of actual legal liability back to the owner. So you need to be really careful if you're going to engage in rental arbitrage. Now, if an owner says you can do it, it can be a low-cost way to enter into the business of being a short-term rental host. So it could make sense. Just be really aware you need the specific written permission from the owner. Now, most people do not engage in rental arbitrage. They actually go out and acquire a property by buying it. So if you buy the property, maybe you pay cash, you probably are taking out a mortgage loan. If you take out a mortgage, that means you have a mortgage cost. And so that's one of your costs of engaging in this business. Your business model needs to record what those cost categories are. So you've got your mortgage payment. Well, in addition to the mortgage, you're going to have to pay for property taxes. Every jurisdiction charges some level of property tax. And we'll talk a little bit more about that in a couple minutes. You will also need to account for a homeowner association fee if the property is located in an HOA, in a homeowners association, sometimes referred to as a common interest community or CIC. Additionally, you'll need to acquire homeowners insurance. That protects your property in the case of damage, in the case of injury. Now, we'll talk a little bit more about that shortly as well, but just create your line item for homeowners insurance. Now, there may be some additional fees that you're going to need to pay, and so you want to put them into your cost model. You may need a business license. In most jurisdictions, you're probably going to need to have a business license because you're engaged in business. You'll need to perhaps have a hoteling license based on the rules of the particular jurisdiction. And then there are other costs that are required. So in order to run an Airbnb, you need to have the property needs to be furnished. Now, there are some other costs that are going to be very specific to running your short-term rental business. You need to clean the property. You need to clean the property before the first guest and after every additional guest is there. Put in a line for cleaning. This is a big line, by the way. You're also going to need to post your property onto various sites to make it available. And those sites may charge fees to you. And so you need a line for those fees. And then really importantly, you're going to need to account for the management of the property. Who's going to check in the guests? Who's going to respond to complaints the guests have? Who's going to need to respond when repairs need to be made? If a guest calls and says, I accidentally broke the oven door off, right? How's that going to be taken care of? So you have the repair costs themselves, but you have to have somebody, it may be yourself, it may be somebody else, who's responsible for taking care of the guest activity, check in, check out, finding ways to advertise to get guests, ways to make sure the property is being maintained over time beyond cleaning, and responding to all the requests that come in from the particular short-term rental guest that you have in the property. So those line items, that creates your business model. But now to figure out whether or not this is going to work, we need to start plugging in numbers. Before we can plug in numbers, though, we have to ask the question and answer the question, well, where are we going to engage in this activity? And we need to know where before we can start putting in the numbers to the business model, because where may very well determine the levels of those numbers. So for example, we were looking at downtown Columbus, Ohio, and the revenue number for average daily rate on the properties that we saw in downtown Columbus about $87 a night. We were looking in Waikiki, in Hawaii, and we were seeing numbers that might be $400, $500 a night. So the revenue side is going to be contingent, at least in part, on where you're locating. Well, the same thing's going to happen on costs. So let's think about the where question. And I'm going to suggest when you're thinking about where, instead of thinking about where would I like to be, think first about regulation. The regulatory environment is really critical to whether or not you can be successful doing short-term rentals, whether or not you can even legally do short-term rentals. So let's think about it this way. In some jurisdictions, short-term rentals are just simply banned. You're not allowed to engage in the activity. And if you do, you could find yourself subjected to all sorts of fines from the local jurisdiction, and you could even be forced to sell your property. You may lose a lot of money. And so you do not want to engage in the activity where it's not permitted. Now, there's two ways that the activity may be permissible. One, there may be a regulation that says that short-term rentals are allowed. Two, there may be no regulation at all. If there's no regulation, there's a risk that there could be regulation in the future that deprives you of being able to engage in the activity that you could legally when you first opened the property. You may actually be better off going into an environment that already has a regulatory regime in place that says this is fine, because then you know it's fine and you're going to be protected going forward, because the regulation's not likely to start taking things away. And even if it does, existing short-term rental owners and hosts will be protected. They'll be grandfathered in because they've acquired an economic right that was specifically permitted in that jurisdiction. Now, do note, just because the local government, whether it's the county or the city, allows Airbnb activity, if the property is located in a homeowners association, the HOA itself may also have rules, and those rules you also need to conform to. So you want to make sure that you understand what those rules are for an HOA every bit as much as you know the regulations for the local jurisdiction. And so that's the first part of where. And by the way, each jurisdiction that permits the short-term rental activity may have different rules about the things you need to do in order to engage in the activity correctly. So some jurisdictions will require you to get a hotel license. Some jurisdictions will require you to pay a hoteling tax. If you need a hotel license, put that in as a line item in your costs for your business model. If you need to pay hoteling tax, make sure that's in there for a cost. Okay. Now, if you're operating a hotel, remember we talked about you need property insurance. If you're operating a business that allows for people to commercially stay in your property, whether they're short-term, they're long-term, whatever, you need to make sure you have the proper kind of insurance. And I'm mentioning this here because some regulatory regimes will require specific types of insurance. And so you want to make sure you know what that regulatory regime requires for insurance. But I'm going to caution you that actually wherever you are, regular property insurance is insufficient for you if you're engaging as an STR host. Why? Because if this guy here is injured or his daughter is injured, then they're going to come after you, and your homeowner's insurance is going to say, these were not simply you or your guests. These were people staying on the property and paying money. They were commercial guests. And so you need to have commercial insurance to make sure you're protected in case something happens to them. right? And there are all sorts of things could happen to them. To make sure that your property is protected in case they do something like start a fire inadvertently. So the insurance is going to be of a commercial nature. Hoteling insurance is what I'll refer to it as. What else is there to think about with regard to where, beyond the regulatory regime and the permissibility of engaging in short-term rental activity? Well, we also want to think about what kinds of activities may be around an area that cause the area to be in greater or lesser demand. What kinds of prices are people able to charge in the area based on sort of the, if you will, the socioeconomic status of the area or the proximity to those things that guests may want to actually attend, engage in, participate in, right? So some people will create their short-term rental properties near national parks. Some people will create their short-term rental properties near universities, right? There's a whole bunch of different kinds of places that you could go. If you're thinking about leisure travelers, you want to make sure that you're opening your properties in places where there exists demand by leisure travelers. Now, those could be rural areas. Those could be areas that are right next door to Disneyland, right? There could be a whole bunch of different types of leisure travelers. And so you want to be able to think about what that demand profile looks like for the leisure traveler that you're trying to target in the particular area. That may change your costs, right? If you're buying a property right next to Disneyland so that you can provide an Airbnb or VRBO experience for somebody who's going to Disneyland, that means you're buying a property that's going to have certain costs associated with it, right? It may be of higher or lower cost than if you're buying a property in Waikiki. It may be more or less expensive to insure. So another thing then with insurance, there are some investors who've decided they're not going to buy anything in Florida any longer because insurance costs vary greatly by geographical area. And because of sea level rise, because of increasing numbers and increasing strength of hurricanes, Florida property insurance has become very expensive, much more expensive than most other areas in the country. And it's caused some investors to pull back and say, this is just no longer viable to invest in Florida. And that's actually whether you want to be a long-term rental owner or a short-term rental host. Property taxes, kind of similar thing. There are states where people have decided, investors have decided, the property taxes are just too high. Texas has very high property taxes. New Jersey has very high property taxes. And so some investors just simply will not invest in those two states because property taxes are so high. There are other states that have much lower property taxes and maybe much lower property insurance premiums as well. And so that reduces your cost. So when you're thinking about where, you're thinking about where in terms of regulation, you're thinking about where in terms of revenue and the impact on revenue, and you're thinking about where in terms of costs and the impact on costs. So you want to think really carefully about that. So your first activity, create the business model, thinking about what are the types of revenue, what are the types of costs. Second activity, pick a couple locations. First issue, figure out the regulatory structure and whether or not it's permissible, and maybe whether or not, even if it's technically permissible, whether or not you can actually engage in it, because there may be restrictions that only people who'd already been doing it can do it, or maybe only 15 people can do it within a particular neighborhood, or what have you. And then you want to start thinking about where in terms of what would that look like for competition, for room rates, for costs, for insurance, for property taxes, costs for cleaners. In some places, cleaners are very readily available and they compete their prices down, and you might be able to clean your property for, I don't know, $80 Other places, cleaners have become kind of scarce, and it's really hard to find cleaners who will be charging less than $150 or maybe even $200 every time a property needs to be cleaned. Management, right? One of your cost items is management. You want to make sure that the area has people who engage in short-term rental property management. And that fee is generally 25 to 35% of the rental rate for a particular night. So if you're charging $100 a night and your management fee is $30, you're paying $30 every single night to that manager. Unless, of course, you're doing all the management on your own. By the way, some regulatory regimes require that you have someone engaged in professional management for you, as opposed to you doing it yourself. So these things, they're interrelated, and you want to engage in the iterative process. Okay, I've got these 10 places I'd like to go, possibly. The regulations suggest, oh wait, only 4 of them are viable because the others are either not permissible or so highly restricted for practical purposes, they're not permissible. Within those 4, these ones have availability of cleaning and property management. This one does not. We're down to 3. Looking at those 3, these are the revenues I can get in each of those 3. And that's going to point you where you actually want to go, right? What's the competition in each of those 3? It's going to point you where you actually want to go. Now, let me make a note here real quickly. When you're thinking about where, you're doing the actual research to plug in the numbers to the business model that you'd created. Your business model was the labels for each of the revenue streams and each of the types of costs. Once you're thinking about where, you're thinking about what the numbers actually will be that will go into those. And you want to start plugging in the actual numbers. Well, some of the numbers may be fairly easy to find, right? You could call up cleaning services and find out what their availability is and what their rates would be. Some of the information may be a little less obvious about where you can find. So for example, revenue. How much could you get for a night of renting out a condo in Waikiki? You can do some research easily by looking at Airbnb, by looking at VRBO and seeing what currently available places are listed at. You also could go to a data provider such as airdna.co, and that provider aggregates a bunch of information about particular markets, about all particular markets, over time periods. And so you could actually do the research and see, all right, condos in Waikiki that are 2 bedrooms in size can generate this level of revenue per night in the slow season, this other level of revenue per night in the high season. And you can start figuring out, oh, also there's an occupancy level. So in the slow season, you're getting this number. And I'm going to make up a number here. Let's say it's $300 a night. And you're only going to rent out at 50% occupancy. So you're getting 15 days a month at $300. That sounds like a lot. That's $4,500 a month. In the high season, it tells you, again, I'm making up the numbers, $400 a month, and you're going to be able to rent out your property for 2/3 of the time. So at $400 a night, 20 nights, that's $8,000 a month. So you've got $4,500 a month during the slow season, $8,000 a month during the high season in Waikiki. Made up numbers. Do not rely on those numbers. But now let's start thinking about the costs, right? So we've got the price of acquisition of the property, and then we've got the carry cost on that. We've got the taxes on that. We've got the HOA fees. We're in a condo, remember? So we've got definitely HOA fees on that. We've got hoteling permit that we're going to be required to get, hotel tax that we're going to need to have. We're going to need to clean the properties. And unless you live in Waikiki, you're going to need a local manager. So if you were getting $4,500 a month, 30% of that is what? 412 is $1,350 per month. So $4,500 minus $1,350 leaves you with $3,150 in revenue, from which you're going to have to subtract all of your additional costs. On the $8,000 high season month, right, 30% of that is $2,400. So you've got $5,600 from which you're going to have to be paying for your cleaning and all of those things. Now, it may turn out there's money to be had. It may turn out this is a losing proposition. There are people who make good money being short-term rental hosts. There are people who've engaged the activity as a business, many of whom have decided to open multiple properties because they may gain some efficiencies in having multiple properties. If you've got two properties that are near each other, maybe you can get a discounted rate on cleaning. If you've got two properties that are near each other, maybe you can gain some efficiency in the management. Or if you're managing yourself, maybe it makes it easier if you've got a couple properties right near you, because you can go from one property to the next to make sure everything's fine, to deal with your guests, etc. Whereas if you've got one property, you don't have those efficiencies. If you've got three properties and each one is located in a completely different area, you lose those potential efficiencies. So as you expand this, you want to think clearly about it as well. Most people who engage in short-term rentals as a host end up losing money. It's actually a high-cost activity with revenues that are insufficient to carry the activity, to give you an actual winning formula on your business model once you've filled in those numbers. Some people are very successful at this. Some of those people got into the business when they were able to acquire properties at a lower fee, maybe like 2019. So they were buying in at a lower price. There was less competition when they were buying in. There were many fewer hosts. And so they also had access to more of the travelers, a greater percentage of the people who might be staying in a particular area. AirDNA shows pretty clearly that while there are more short-term rental guests, there are actually far more short-term rental hosts that have entered the business, which is creating competition that may drive down nightly rates on properties, but is definitely driving down average occupancy on properties in most markets. And so you want to be very aware of that. Now, having looked at the business model, having looked at where we're going to actually engage in this business, and then having filled in the business model with all the numbers, we may find, as I said, this is a great business, this is a lousy business because you're going to lose money all the time, or it's a very marginal business where you may still say, you know what, I want to do this, I'm going to do it, even though it's not going to bring me much money. Couple things to think about. If this is a business, the first question after we've done all that research that you really need to answer is this going to be an active business or a passive business? If this is a passive business, a passive trade or activity, as the IRS would call it, it means that you're not engaged in the activity all of the time, you're not doing all of the work, you're relying on other people, your dollar costs are going to be higher because you're not substituting your own labor for these things. So your cost of the activity are going to be higher. But that's fine, that's not inherently bad. If this is an active business, an active trader business, as the IRS would call it, then you need to think about, all right, I'm going to substitute some portion of my labor for some of these costs. And maybe I'm going to do all the cleaning, or maybe I'm going to do all of the management, or maybe I'm going to do both, right? So there's actually definitions in the tax code about what qualifies as an active trade or business. And it's related to the level of activity that you're putting in absolute terms, and related to the level of activity that you're putting in terms relative to other people putting in activity on your business. If this is an active trader business, it brings with you some potentially some substantial tax benefits. If this is a passive trader business, you'll get some, but much more limited tax benefits. Again, I'm not a tax accountant, and this is generic information. Hire a tax accountant who specializes in short-term rentals to not just validate the information, but to apply this to you specifically, because it could make this activity into something that's much more viable for you. Couple things. One, some people say, buy a short-term rental where you would like to vacation, because that way, when the property is not being rented out, you can stay there. Problem. If you're thinking about this as a business activity, then the business activity means you cannot stay at the property more than 14 days. So just know that. If you stay there for more than 14 days, this is a personal activity, not a business activity, and the tax benefits will largely go away. 2, short-term rental is defined as 7 days or less on average for each guest during a particular stay. You want to keep that in mind. If you're thinking just because you could go on to Airbnb and rent something for 30 days, or put your property up to be able to be rented for 30 days, that's not actually a short-term rental. Once you go over the 7 days, you move into something else. You move into a long-term rental for tax purposes. So you want to be aware of that. Now, you could have one guest who stays with you 4 nights a week, every week for 3 months. That's okay. As long as they're checking out, they're coming back in, and they can't do it just for like 1 minute. They're going to have average stays of less than 7 days. Now, you might have some tenant who comes in during the course of the year and stays for 12 days. That's okay. Average 7 days or less to be a short-term rental business. If you go over that, if your average is 8 days, you're not in the short-term rental business, and you're going to lose some of the very significant tax benefits that you might otherwise be able to capture. You should think about your business as not simply renting out nights of a place to stay, right? That's what most people do. But rather, you're renting out an experience where people stay at the experience. If you do that, you might be able to get revenues that are higher than average within a particular market, because you're providing something that's maybe more interesting, maybe better, right? Higher end furniture, it's a luxury experience. A pool, maybe it's breakfast cereals or games that are sitting there in the property. Maybe you provide motorbikes that your guests can take out, or go-karts, and you allow your guests to take those things, right? You provide the full concierge service. You'll be able to get a higher per night rate on your STR than will people who provide nothing except a place to sleep. But another caution, another tripwire. If you provide too high a level of service, if you're providing daily cleaning, if you're providing cooked meals, you could exceed what the IRS is going to allow you to have in the activity that you're providing. And if the IRS decides, no, you're not actually a short-term rental business any longer, you're actually a service business because you're providing all of these extra things, you're going to lose the benefits of the tax code as related to being a short-term rental host. So you want to be careful. You want to be providing experiences, but you don't want to go too far in that. You definitely don't want to go into providing high levels of personalized concierge services. You're still wanting to be just an STR host, right? On a nice property, on a property that people want to stay in. You want to make sure you're not staying there too much. You want to make sure that your average rental period is that 7 days or less, right? So you're doing all of those things, and you're actively managing, actively participating in your STR business. What are the tax benefits you can get? Well, you would get in all your various revenues, all those costs that you noted in your business model, those are actually deductible. You're running a business, and so those are deductible. And that offsets the revenue that you were collecting on your business, right? So you're receiving money in, you're paying these costs, you're only having to pay tax on the difference. But because your business involves real property, the IRS says that if you're using your real property as a business, it must be depreciated. Depreciation is simply a fictitious number that the IRS declares property devalues at over a period of time. Some properties devalue more quickly than other properties. So personal property like furniture devalues much more quickly. It degrades, it loses its ability to perform its proper service much more quickly than a building. You get a depreciation allowance because you're engaged in this business on that property. And so you can take the depreciation. In fact, you must. The IRS says you must take the depreciation. Let's say that your costs were $10,000, your revenues were $12,000 over the course of a year, but you had $2,000 of depreciation. That allowance offsets the revenues. So now, even though you put $2,000 a year into your pocket, that gets written off for tax purposes because you depreciated $2,000. You've got no taxable income that was generated from your short-term rental activity. Well, that's kind of interesting, right? That makes this nice. You're putting a couple $1,000s into your pocket and you're not having to pay any tax on that. But this gets better. Different types of property, as I mentioned, are depreciated at different rates. So if you engage the appropriate people, a particular type of qualified engineer, to examine your property, they can come up with a depreciation document schedule that will allow you to segregate your personal property, your shorter term depreciation property from the structure itself. So the structure of a house is 27 and a half years for its depreciation schedule. But cabinets, carpets, draperies, landscaping, all of those things depreciate at a faster pace if you engage in the cost segregation analysis. You need the appropriate people to be able to do that analysis for you. And then you need an accountant who, again, knows and understands how you utilize that information because they're used to working with rental properties. Short-term or long-term rental properties both can potentially benefit from this cost segregation analysis. But that would mean if instead of having your $300,000 property depreciate across 27 and a half years, getting about a little less than $11,000 a year worth of depreciation that you could write off against income, you could actually take depreciation more quickly on those properties, those personal property elements that would depreciate more quickly, maybe over 5 years. So let's say you've got $100,000 that can depreciate in 5 years. That's a $20,000 allowance every year. The other $200,000 of the property depreciates over 27 and a half years because it's maybe the structure of the property. Then that $200,000 into the 27 and a half years, whatever, $8,000, let's just say, per year. So in the first year, you'd be able to, each of the first 5 years, you'd have a depreciation allowance of $28,000. And in subsequent years, you'd have a depreciation allowance of $8,000. Now, a problem ensues, however, and this is really important. You cannot take depreciation greater than the income associated with the activity. So let's say, for example, you've got $12,000 of revenue, you've got $10,000 of cost, you've got $2,000 extra dollars of revenue that are going to be taxed, except you have a depreciation allowance of $28,000. Well, that offsets the $2,000. There's no tax on that $2,000 of revenue that you're putting in your pocket, but it leaves you with $26,000. What are you going to do with that $26,000? Well, it's going to sit there looking pretty on your tax worksheets, but you cannot use it if this is a passive trade or activity. If it's an active trade or activity, you can actually use that $26,000 to offset your regular ordinary income that you took as a W-2 employee or a 1099 contractor or self-employment income, right? So your short-term rental business could actually generate for you real, totally legitimate, detailed in the tax code tax losses through this what's referred to as bonus depreciation from your cost segregation. And you've just written off $26,000 of your regular income, as well as putting this $2,000 of short-term rental income into your pocket with no tax. So let's say that you made $62,000 through your W-2 job during the course of a year. But after you took account of everything from the short-term rental business, you've got an extra $26,000 for this year that you could write off. So that would leave you with $36,000 of taxable income, because you've written off $2,000 on the short-term rental, you've written off $26,000 on your $62,000 of income. You only have to pay tax on $36,000 this year because the rest of it's been covered by your depreciation allowance. To do that must be active trader business. That means you absolutely cannot be going over 14 days of personal use. You absolutely must make sure your tenants are staying for 7 days or less on average. It means absolutely you're not running a concierge business, a service business. It means you're running just a short-term rental business. That can be really valuable to you, right? And so it's not necessarily great business sense to engage in activities specifically to capture tax losses, but the IRS will allow you to capture every appropriate tax loss if you're engaged in an activity that generates those tax losses and it's a legitimate business in and of itself, right? So this could make a short-term rental business something that's viable, something that's important to you, as opposed to it's an iffy proposition, maybe it's slightly beneficial, maybe it's not. If you trip on any of the tripwires, you're going to lose all that benefit. So you want to be really careful about it. Build a business model, figure out where. That means looking at regulations, and that means looking at additional information about where, looking at the revenue from AirDNA, looking at the costs that are associated with the issue, and then figuring out, all right, I know I can do it as a business. I know what my business model is, and I know what the numbers are that can be calculated because I've picked a location. Then figure out, is it going to be an active trader business, which can give you lots and lots of tax benefits? Is it going to be a passive trader business where you're not going to be able to take those surplus tax issues into account? That's okay. It still may be viable for you. Those are things to think about when you're thinking about whether or not you want to be a short-term rental host. Again, reach out to us. We are obviously highly analytical. We look at all of the real property type of activities that you can engage in from multiple angles to figure out whether or not you're properly building wealth through real estate. Whether you're looking to buy or sell primary residence, buy or sell an investment property, we look at these things because we're investors ourselves. We want to understand what the issues are, and we'll help you through the activities. And we're connected to the specialists, the specialized engineers who engage in these cost segregation studies, and we can give referrals. We're connected to some accountants and attorneys who specialize in real estate and real estate investing, and we can connect you to those people as well. So please, if you're new to this channel, subscribe. If you're interested in more about the short-term rentals, I'm going to be doing additional short-term rental videos because the regulatory environment is really consequential to you. It's something you need to know about and think about. And so hit the notification bell so you know when these new videos come out. And please smash the like button if you find this interesting or valuable whatsoever. I am Justin Miller with the Chong Miller Group. I look forward to seeing you in the next video. Thank you.